Okay, let's dive in. Imagine this scenario. The Getty Museum, right? They're about to buy this multi-million-dollar ancient statue, a Koros, supposedly from the 6th century BC.
A huge deal for any museum.
Exactly. And they do their homework. I mean, really do their homework. 14 months, scientific tests, legal reviews. They're taking core samples using electron microscopes, X-ray diffraction, you name it.
Checking all the boxes. The science looks good. The paperwork seems legit. It all points to, yeah, this thing's real.
So naturally, they buy it, put it on display.
And then what happens? Some of the world's top art experts, people who've spent their lives looking at this stuff, they walk in, they take one look, one glance.
And instantly they know something is just wrong.
Yeah.
Deeply wrong.
Yeah, one guy, Federico Ziri, apparently zeroed in on the fingernails. Just didn't look right to him. Another expert, Thomas Hoving, remembered later the first words that popped into his head were like, sorry to hear that, when he found out the Getty had bought it. Just an immediate negative feeling.
And another one, Georgios Dantas, director of the Acropolis Museum at the time, felt this sort of glass between me and the work, like it lacked authenticity. Another expert used the word fresh to describe it.
Fresh. For a 2,000-year-old statue that's supposed to have been buried, that's not good. Someone else, Angelos Dilavorius, talked about this wave of intuitive repulsion.
Intuitive repulsion. I love that phrase. But think about that contrast, right? You've got 14 months of the Getty's careful, scientific, documented analysis on one side.
Millions spent on the investigation and the piece itself.
And on the other side, a few seconds. A glance. A gut feeling. A word like fresh popping into someone's head.
And the expert's snap judgment. It turned out to be spot on. It took the Getty, over a year? For the whole story to unravel, the faked documents, the weird mix of artistic styles, the discovery you could actually fake the marble's aging process with, like potato mold or something.
Potato mold. Unbelievable. But the experts knew. They knew in a blink.
And that gap, that huge difference between the long, deliberate analysis and the power of that instant judgment, well, that's what this deep dive is really all about.
We're digging into the power and maybe the mystery of snap judgments, of what the source material we're drawing on, mainly the book Blink, calls thinking without thinking.
Yeah, we want to unpack what the source reveals about how much can actually happen in those first 2 seconds. How valuable can that blink of an eye be compared to, weeks or months of careful thought?
And this isn't just about art history or museums. This is really about you listening right now. It's about how you meet new people, how you make a quick decision when you're under pressure, how you size things up fast.
What's going on in your brain during those first couple of seconds, and why does it actually matter? Let's explore what the source calls the power of the glance.
So this idea of focusing on the first 2 seconds, the blink. The Koros story is just such a perfect illustration. These Ziri, Hoving, Dantas, all of them, they weren't standing there making arc lists.
No, they weren't consciously analyzing stylistic elements point by point or demanding the provenance reports right then. It was different. They just felt it.
Ziri sees the fingernails. Hoving gets the word fresh. Dantas feels that glass barrier. Dilavorius feels intuitive repulsion. It wasn't like an intellectual exercise at that moment.
It was visceral, right, a gut reaction. They probably couldn't have articulated exactly why right then and there, but they knew something was off.
And they were right, way before the deliberate investigation proved it. So how does that work? How can a quick look sometimes trump months of science?
Well, the source digs into this idea of fast and frugal thinking, and it uses the Iowa gambling experiment as a really key example. Picture this. You're in an experiment playing a card game.
Okay.
4 decks of cards, 2 red, 2 blue. Your goal is simple. Win as much money as possible by taking cards. What you don't know is that the decks are rigged.
Ah, okay. How so?
The red decks offer big rewards, like $100 payouts sometimes. But they also hit you with huge, unpredictable losses, really painful ones. The blue decks, on the other hand, give smaller, steadier wins, maybe $50, and much smaller penalties. Over the long run, the blue decks are way better.
So the smart strategy is to stick with the blue decks.
Exactly. Now, if you try to figure this out consciously using your logical brain, the source says it takes most people about 80 cards drawn before they can articulate why the blue decks are better. They have to see enough wins and losses to build the pattern.
80 cards. That's quite a few. That's the slow, deliberate way.
Right. But here's the kicker. The scientists were also monitoring the players' physical stress responses. They had sensors on their palms measuring sweat gland activity.
Like a lie detector test, sort of.
Kind of, yeah. Measuring subconscious stress. And what they found was fascinating. Players started showing a stress response. Their palms started sweating when they merely reached for the bad red decks, after only about the 10th card.
10 cards. Whoa. That's way before the 80 cards needed for conscious understanding.
Yeah. 70 cards earlier. And even before they could consciously say, hey, I think these red decks might be bad, maybe around card 40 or 50, their behavior started changing. They started unconsciously favoring the blue decks.
So their bodies knew. Their unconscious mind figured it out almost immediately, like after just 10 cards.
It seems so. It picked up the underlying pattern incredibly quickly, but instead of sending a memo to the conscious brain saying, "Danger, Will Robinson," it sent the message through sweaty palms. And it started guiding behavior before the conscious mind even had a clue.
Okay, so you've got these two systems, right? One is slow, analytical, needs lots of data, takes 80 cards. The other is super fast, works below the surface, picks up patterns almost instantly, but communicates indirectly through feelings or physical reactions.
Exactly. And the source argues that the Koros experts were tapping into that second system, that fast, frugal, unconscious path. Their initial reaction wasn't slow analysis, it was a blink.
Their brains processed all that visual info, ran some incredibly complex pattern recognition program.
And before conscious thought could even form, bam, they got a signal, a feeling, fresh, repulsion, sweaty palms for the art world maybe. It was a message from that part of the brain working behind the scenes.
Let's give that part of the brain a name. The source uses the term adaptive unconscious.
Right. That's the part doing the quick leaps, the instant conclusions. And it's important to clarify, this isn't the old Freudian idea of the unconscious, full of dark, repressed stuff.
No, this is different.
It's more like this giant, incredibly powerful computer that's constantly processing data in the background, quickly and efficiently, mostly to help us navigate the world safely and effectively.
Like, jumping out of the way of a bus. You don't stop and calculate speed and distance consciously. Your adaptive unconscious just makes you move. Survival instinct, basically.
Psychologist Timothy D. Wilson puts it nicely. He says the mind delegates a lot of high-level thinking to this unconscious system, putting us on automatic pilot. It sizes up situations, warns us of danger, sets goals, initiates action, all happening very fast, very efficiently, below the level of awareness.
And we flip between this automatic mode and our conscious, deliberate thinking all the time, right? Like, planning dinner might be conscious, but suddenly arguing with someone might trigger more of that unconscious automatic reaction.
Exactly. And we rely on this adaptive unconscious constantly. Meeting someone new, instant impression. Job interviews, quick judgments are being made on both sides. Reacting to a new idea, making decisions under pressure.
That Nalini M. body study the source mentions is mind-blowing. Students watch silent video clips of college professors they've never met.
Just tiny clips, right? Like 10 seconds, 5 seconds, even 2 seconds long.
2 seconds. And based on just that silent glimpse, the students' ratings of how effective they thought the teacher would be strongly matched the end-of-semester evaluations from students who'd actually taken the full course with that professor for months.
Incredible. That's serious predictive power packed into just a couple of seconds of observation. Thin slicing in action.
Now, I know what some people listening might be thinking. Our whole culture kind of teaches us the opposite, doesn't it? Haste makes waste. Look before you leap. Don't judge a book by its cover. We're taught to trust careful, conscious deliberation.
Right. We value thoughtfulness, analysis. We're skeptical of gut feelings.
And a central argument in Blank is that this skepticism might be misplaced sometimes. That decisions made very quickly, using this adaptive unconscious, can often be just as good and in some situations, maybe even better than the ones we agonize over, especially under pressure, or when there's just too much information to process consciously.
And this is a really important, but the source isn't saying snap judgments are infallible. It's not magic. The second big task of Blink, it argues, is to understand when and why our instincts lead us astray.
Which brings us back to the Getty and the Koros. If it was so obviously fake, or at least problematic, to those experts who saw it for a few seconds, why did the Getty, with all its resources and its own experts, spend 14 months convincing themselves it was real and then buy it? Why did their instincts fail or get ignored?
The source suggests their gut feelings were basically thwarted. Part of it was maybe the scientific data at the time seemed persuasive. There was this geologist, Stanley Margolis, who'd published analysis suggesting the surface couldn't be faked. That carried weight.
Okay, so science seemed to trump intuition initially.
But maybe more importantly, the source suggests the Getty wanted it to be real. Really, really wanted it. They were a young museum then, ambitious, eager to make a splash, to build their collection with a world-class piece like that.
So desire blinded them. That urge to believe was stronger than any niggling doubts their own experts might have felt.
It seems like a strong possibility. Desire, emotion, these things can definitely throw off our unconscious processing. There's this other story in the source about Ernst Langlotz, a major German art historian. As a young man, he bought a bronze statuette. Turned out later it was a fake. But even after he became this world-renowned expert, he apparently couldn't bring himself to admit his first purchase was bogus. Another collector, George Ortiz, speculated Langlotz just fell in love with the piece and couldn't question that initial emotional connection, despite all his later knowledge.
Wow. So falling in love with an idea or a statue can shut down that critical instinct.
Exactly. The adaptive unconscious is powerful, but it's fallible. It's not a perfect oracle. It can be influenced, misled, or even completely disabled by our own interests, our emotions, the context. So a key skill is learning to recognize when it's likely to be reliable and when it might be compromised. The source argues that failures of rapid cognition usually happen for specific, identifiable reasons.
And the third big message, which is kind of hopeful, is that this ability, this snap judgment skill, isn't just some mystical gift you're born with or not.
Right. The source makes a strong case that snap judgments can be educated and controlled. It's a skill we can actually develop.
It mentions people across professions. Doctors developing diagnostic intuition, military leaders with their coup d'oeil, coaches spotting talent, designers with an eye for what works. These people learn to shape and manage their unconscious reactions through experience and deliberate practice.
It's not just for the chosen few art connoisseurs, it's trainable. Okay, so let's dig a bit deeper into how this actually works, this idea of thin slicing.
Right. Thin slicing, that's the term the source uses for this ability. The ability to find meaningful patterns in behavior or situations based on really narrow windows of experience.
Like the Koros experts seeing the truth in a glance. Or the Iowa gamblers figuring out the decks after just a few cards unconsciously.
It's like the unconscious mind is running this incredibly fast, automated version of what would otherwise be slow, painstaking analysis. How is that possible?
The work of psychologist John Gottman on married couples is presented as a prime example. He sets up this love lab.
Sounds ominous.
Maybe a little. He brings couples in, hooks them up to sensors measuring heart rate, sweat, things like that. Then he videotapes them having a 15-minute conversation about some point of conflict in their marriage.
Okay, 15 minutes of arguing, basically, or discussing.
Discussing, yeah. And then his team analyzes these tapes meticulously using something called the SPAFF coding system. They assign an emotion code from a list of like 20 emotions: anger, contempt, whining, affection, neutral, etc., to every single second of that interaction.
Every second for 15 minutes. That's a lot of data points. 1-800 numbers per couple, plus the heart rate and sweat data.
Exactly. Extremely detailed. Based on patterns in this data, Gottman found he could predict with stunning accuracy whether a couple would still be married 15 years later. Like 95% accuracy if he watches for an hour. About 90% from just that 15-minute conversation.
90% from 15 minutes. That's already incredible.
Would it get better? Or maybe faster? His colleague Sybil Carrere found they could still make fairly impressive predictions about divorce based on watching just the first 3 minutes of the conversation.
3 minutes. You can predict the fate of a marriage in the time it takes to microwave popcorn. How?
It sounds crazy, right? The source gives this example of a couple, Bill and Sue. On the surface, they seem okay, talking about their dog, no shouting or obvious hostility.
Pretty normal conversation, maybe a little tense.
But one of Gottman's trained coders, Amber Tabares, watching the tape, picks up on these tiny, fleeting signals. Bill's defensiveness, he keeps doing this yes but thing or cross-complaining. Sue does these almost imperceptible eye rolls when he talks.
The eye roll. Lethal.
Classic sign of contempt, according to Gottman. Tabares also notes Sue's slightly patronizing tone, the way she briefly closes her eyes. It's not overt aggression, but these subtle negative cues add up.
So the coder isn't just listening to the words. They're looking for these micro-expressions, these quick flashes of negativity.
Exactly. And they're looking at the overall pattern, the ratio of positive to negative moments. Gottman found it needs to be at least 5 positive to 1 negative for a marriage to thrive. But more than that, they're seeing what Gottman calls the fist of the marriage.
The fist. Like a signature.
Yeah, or like marital DNA. The idea is that every marriage has a unique, stable pattern of interaction, a signature style. And that underlying pattern, that fist, will show up in almost any meaningful interaction, whether they're arguing about finances or just telling the story of how they met.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like the core dynamic reveals itself quickly.
The source uses this great analogy from WWYI Morse code operators. Apparently, every telegrapher had a unique rhythm and spacing when they sent messages, even using standard dots and dashes. They called it their fist.
So you could recognize who was sending.
British intelligence officers could. They learned to identify individual German operators just by their fist. They could track troop movements by recognizing, that's Oscar's fist, he must be near Tobruk now. It's unconscious, it's stable, and it reveals itself in very small samples.
Just like a marriage's fist reveals itself in a few minutes of conversation.
Wow. And Gottman argues these patterns are really stable because couples tend to fall into one of two states. Either positive sentiment override, where the overall feeling is so good that minor irritations get brushed off, or negative sentiment override.
And in negative sentiment override,
Everything gets interpreted negatively. Even neutral comments sound hostile. Attempts to make up are seen as manipulation. And once a couple is firmly in that negative state, Gottman found 94% of them continued down that path towards divorce. It's like a spiral. The 3-minute snapshot reviews which state they're in.
Okay, so Gottman can see this fist in 3 minutes. But the author of Blink tried it himself, watched the tapes, and was terrible at predicting. Barely better than flipping a coin, like 53% accuracy. Why the difference?
Well, he was like most people, including, interestingly, many trained marriage therapists who also tried. They got overwhelmed. Trying to track all 20 emotions, plus body language, plus tone, plus what's actually being said. It's just information overload. You can't see the forest for the trees.
Too much noise. So how does Gottman do it? What's his secret?
He simplifies. He doesn't pay attention to everything. He learned through analyzing thousands of hours of tapes to focus on the signals that matter most. He looks for what he famously calls the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in relationships.
The 4 horsemen. Okay, what are they?
Defensiveness, stonewalling, which is shutting down, refusing to engage, criticism and contempt.
And is one of those more important than the others?
Absolutely. The source emphasizes that Gottman found contempt is by far the most corrosive and predictive.
Contempt. How is that different from just, say, criticism?
Criticism attacks the person's behavior. You never do the dishes. Contempt attacks the person's character, their sense of self, and it comes from a place of superiority. It's saying, you are lazy. Or worse, things like, you're a bitch, you're scum. It's trying to put the other person down, makes them feel worthless.
That sounds really damaging.
It is. The source notes it's so toxic, it's correlated with the recipient actually getting sick. More often, it impacts their immune system. It's fundamentally related to the emotion of disgust. Like you want to expel or reject the person. And interestingly, unlike some other negative patterns, Gottman found no real gender difference in who expresses contempt.
So contempt is the killer signal. By focusing on that, Gottman cuts through the noise.
Exactly. He simplifies the task dramatically. And the argument is that thin slicing, when our unconscious does it well, is essentially doing the same thing automatically. It's rapidly sifting through all the available data, throwing out the irrelevant stuff, and locking onto the few crucial pieces of information, like the presence of contempt, that really tell the story. Often, the source suggests, this unconscious filtering is better than trying to consciously process everything.
Okay. Finding hidden patterns by focusing on key signals. The source takes this idea into a totally different context next, right?
Huh?
With psychologist Samuel Gosling and dorm rooms.
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. Gosling asked a basic question. If you want to understand someone's personality, what's better? Knowing them well, like meeting up twice a week for a whole year, a really thick slice of experience, or just spending about 30 minutes looking around their dorm room when they're not there, a very thin slice of their personal space.
Logically, you'd think knowing them for a year would be way better.
That's what you'd assume. But Gosling found the opposite, at least for certain traits. Strangers who only spent half an hour looking around the dorm room were actually better than the person's close friends at accurately judging their conscientiousness, like how organized and hardworking they are, their emotional stability, and their openness to new experiences.
Wait, really? Strangers looking at a room beat close friends. How is that even possible?
Gosling argues that our personal spaces are just packed with clues about us. He talks about 3 types. Identity claims, Things we display deliberately to make a statement, like a diploma or a political poster.
Okay, like showing off your achievements or affiliations.
Then there's behavioral residue, the unintentional traces left by our actions. Like, is the room messy or neat? Are the CDs alphabetized or scattered? Dirty laundry on the floor? These tell you about habits and tidiness.
Right, the physical evidence of how someone lives.
And finally, thoughts and feelings regulators, things people use to manage their mood or atmosphere. Scented candles, comfy pillows, photos of loved ones, specific types of music playing. These hint at their emotional life and what makes them feel good.
So by looking at these clues, you get an instant snapshot of certain personality dimensions, orderliness, openness, maybe comfort-seeking.
Exactly, you're seeing a kind of personality fist revealed in the space. But crucially, the source points out what you avoid by looking at the room instead of interacting face-to-face.
What do you avoid?
All the noise and confusion of direct interaction, people trying to present a certain image, maybe acting awkward or relevant conversational detours, and you avoid your own biases and stereotypes that might kick in when you meet someone.
Like the dumb jock stereotype you mentioned. You might judge a big athlete harshly face-to-face, but their meticulously organized bookshelf in their room tells a different story about their conscientiousness.
Precisely. Plus, people aren't always the best judges of themselves, are they? They might consciously believe they're one way but act another, or they might just not know how they come across. Remember Sybil Carrere saying how shocked couples were when they heard themselves on Gottman's tapes, thinking they were calm when they sounded really negative?
So the dorm room doesn't lie, or get awkward, or try to manage impressions in the same way a person does.
Right. It offers this indirect, less filtered view. It's like Gottman looking at the subtle interaction patterns or the physiological data, rather than just asking couples, are you happy? Because they might not answer accurately or even know the real answer. He takes a sideways approach.
And the dorm room observers were doing the same thing. They were acting like amateur Gottmans, using a sideways approach, looking for the student's fist, through indirect evidence their stuff. Their task was simplified because they weren't distracted by the actual person, and they made surprisingly good predictions.
It really reinforces this idea that sometimes the indirect path, the thin slice of seemingly peripheral information, can be a quicker and more accurate route to understanding than direct, prolonged engagement.
And this applies even in life or death situations, like predicting which doctors get sued for malpractice.
Yeah, that's another powerful example in the source. It poses the question, if you want to predict a doctor's risk of being sued, should you examine their credentials, their training, their record of errors, or should you just listen to short clips of them talking to patients?
Again, my logical brain says, look at their error rate. Surely that's what matters.
But the research cited says, surprisingly, no. A doctor's likelihood of being sued actually have very little correlation with how many mistakes they make. Plenty of highly skilled doctors with few errors get sued, while others who make more mistakes don't. And most medical injuries never result in a lawsuit anyway.
So if it's not about the mistakes, what is it about?
The source argues it comes down to that something else, basically, how patients feel they were treated on a personal level. Did the doctor seem rushed? Did they listen? Did they show respect? Were they treated poorly?
It's the relationship, the bedside manner.
Pretty much. The source quotes a malpractice lawyer, Alice Birkin, saying point blank, people just don't sue doctors they like. She tells the story about a client who insisted on suing her internist over a delayed cancer diagnosis, even though the radiologist might have been more at fault, simply because she felt the internist treated her dismissively, never looked at me as a whole person. It's about feeling heard and respected.
So doctors who don't explain things or seem dismissive are higher risk.
That's what Wendy Levinson's research found. She recorded conversations between doctors who'd been sued frequently and those who hadn't. The doctors who weren't sued generally spent a bit more time with patients, about 3 minutes longer on average. They made orienting comments like, first I'll examine you, then we'll talk. They used more active listening techniques, more humor.
Okay, so they were more engaged, more communicative.
Critically, though, Levinson found no difference in the amount or the quality of medical information they provided. The content was the same. The difference was entirely in how they talked to patients, their tone, their manner.
And then Nalini Ambati, who did the teacher rating study, took this even further with surgeons' voices.
She did. This is amazing. She took tiny audio snippets of surgeons talking to patients, just two 10-second clips from two different patient interactions, so only 40 seconds of audio per surgeon in total.
40 seconds, okay.
Then she content filtered the audio. Basically, she electronically garbled the recording so you couldn't understand the words at all, but it preserved the nonverbal aspects of speech. The pitch, the rhythm, the intonation, the pure tone of voice.
So just the sound without the meaning.
Exactly. Then she had people listen to this garbled audio and rate the surgeons' voices on qualities like warmth, hostility, dominance, anxiety.
Yeah, results.
Those ratings, based purely on the sound of the voice from those 40 seconds of garbled audio, significantly predicted which surgeons had previously been sued for malpractice and which hadn't.
That's incredible. They couldn't understand a word, but the tone told them the lawsuit risk.
It seems so. And the single strongest predictor, dominance. Surgeons whose voices came across as more dominant in that garbled audio were significantly more likely to be in the sued group. Those whose voices sounded less dominant, perhaps more concerned or egalitarian, tended to be in the non-sued group.
Wow. So it suggests that something as complex as malpractice risk can often boil down to a fundamental lack of respect, communicated instantly and unconsciously through tone of voice. That dominant tone is just toxic to the patient relationship.
It really seems to be. So the message for you, the listener, is pretty clear, right? If you meet a doctor and just something in their tone makes you feel dismissed or talked down to or like they aren't really listening.
Listen to that feeling.
Yeah, your adaptive unconscious might have just thin-sliced something really important about how they relate to patients, something that could even predict future problems. That quick gut feeling about their tone might be more telling than their diploma on the wall.
So thin slicing isn't some weird magic trick. It's something we all do all the time.
Absolutely. The source argues it's a fundamental human skill. We have to do it to navigate the world, and we rely on it because, as all these examples show, those thin slices can be incredibly informative.
Different fields have names for it, right? Like basketball players having court sense.
Right, or military commanders talk about coup d'oeil, the power of the glance to assess a battlefield situation instantly. Birdwatchers have GIS, which is like getting the immediate overall impression, the essence of a bird in flight, not just ticking off field marks. Like the famous bird artist David Sibley identifying a rare bird just from its shape and movement.
It's that instant subjective judgment that happens before conscious analysis.
The source mentions Hollywood producer Brian Grazer talking about meeting Tom Hanks way back in 1983, when Hanks was basically unknown. Grazer said he knew instantly in that first meeting that Hanks was special.
What was it? Was he funnier or...
Grazer said it wasn't necessarily that Hanks was funnier than other actors he met. It was something about his fundamental likability. Grazer felt you could live inside of him, identify with his struggles, that Hanks could even play unlikable characters and still be forgiven somehow. It was this deep, intuitive read that Grazer only really understood and articulated much later.
And, most of us probably feel that way about Tom Hanks, don't we? Decent, trustworthy, relatable, based entirely on the thin slices we've seen of him in movies and interviews over decades.
Exactly, and that impacts how we experience his films. Grazer talks about Apollo 13. Part of the reason the audience is so invested in saving him is because, well, we like him too much. Our thin-sliced impression influences our engagement.
If we couldn't thin slice, movies wouldn't work. Speed dating would be pointless.
Yeah.
First impressions wouldn't matter. But they do.
And remember that follow-up to the Gottman divorce prediction study, when they gave regular people just a little bit of guidance, like, here's a list of key emotions to watch for, and let them watch 30-second clips twice.
Yeah, what happened then?
Their accuracy shot up. They could predict divorce with over 80% accuracy, so still incredibly impressive, and it shows that the fundamental thin slicing ability is there in most of us. Sometimes it just needs a little focusing or structure to be effective.
Okay, so we've established the power of this instant cognition, this thin slicing. But now we need to tackle the second key point the source makes. These snap judgments aren't just fast. They are also deeply, profoundly unconscious.
Right. This is where it gets even more mysterious. The go-to example in the source is Vic Braden, the famous tennis coach.
What did he do?
He had this almost spooky ability to predict when a professional tennis player was about to double fault. He'd be watching a match, see the player toss the ball, start their motion, and he'd just know. He'd blurt out, "Oh no, double fault." And he was apparently right an uncanny amount of the time, like 16 out of 17 times in one stretch.
Wow. So he could see it coming. But could he explain how he knew?
That's the thing. No, he couldn't. The source says he was tortured by it. He'd try to analyze it afterwards. Did the player hesitate? Was the toss slightly off? Did their elbow look weird? He couldn't pinpoint the cue. Whatever information his brain was using, it was processed entirely unconsciously behind what the source calls the locked door.
The locked door. I like that metaphor. The unconscious mind knows, but it won't tell the conscious mind why.
Exactly like the Koros experts. They felt that repulsion, or the word fresh, popped into their head, but they couldn't immediately give a logical step-by-step explanation. Even professional art authenticators, fake busters, describe their intuition in vague terms, a mental rush, a flurry of visual facts like hummingbirds, or just physical feelings. My stomach felt wrong, a ringing in my ears, feeling woozy.
Not exactly scientific language.
Not at all. Hardly scientific, as one is quoted. So the big point here is that rapid cognition, thin slicing, it happens behind this locked door. We don't have conscious access to the process by which our unconscious mind reaches its conclusions, and frankly, our culture finds that really uncomfortable.
We don't like mystery when it comes to decisions, do we? We want reasons, explanations, justification.
Totally. We demand decisions be sourced and footnoted, as the source puts it. We want people to elaborate on their feelings. Think about George Soros' son saying half his dad's complex market theories were just rationalizations, that the real trigger was often just his back starting to hurt, some physical precursor to market shifts that his body picked up unconsciously.
Or Jack Welch calling his memoir straight from the gut, but then filling it with detailed management systems and principles. We want the gut feeling, but we also demand the logical framework after the fact.
And remember the Getty. It was much easier for them to trust the scientists and lawyers with their pages and pages of documentation than to trust the art experts who just had a strong, unexplained negative feeling.
So the source is arguing that this insistence on always having a conscious explanation can actually be a mistake, that sometimes we need to trust the judgment even if we can't explain it.
Yes. To really leverage the power of rapid cognition, we might need to accept its mysterious nature more often. Accept that it's possible to know without knowing why we know, and maybe sometimes we're better off not knowing why, letting that unconscious process run without conscious interference.
How much is really going on behind that locked door, though? Are we talking small adjustments or major influences?
No, it seems like major influences. The source dives into John Barg's priming experiments, which are just mind-bending demonstrations of the unconscious at work.
Priming. That's when subtle cues influence our subsequent thoughts or behavior, right?
Exactly, without us realizing it. The scrambled sentence test is a famous one. People are asked to unscramble lists of words to make short sentences. For one group, the lists contain words subtly associated with old age, like worried, Florida, lonely, gray, bingo, wrinkle.
Okay, so the conscious task is just making sentences.
Right. But unconsciously, their brain is processing all these old words. It's being primed to think about age. And the result, when those subjects finished the test and left the room, they physically walked more slowly down the hallway than subjects who'd unscrambled neutral words. The priming affected their actual physical behavior completely outside their awareness.
They walked slower just because they read words like Florida and wrinkle? That's wild.
Isn't it? And the rude versus polite priming study is even more striking. Same setup. Unscramble sentences. One group gets words related to rudeness, like bother, intrude, aggressively. The other gets words related to politeness, respect, considerate, patiently.
Okay, primed for rudeness or politeness. Then what?
Then they're told to go talk to the experimenter down the hall. But, the experimenter is already deep in conversation with someone else, a Confederate, blocking the doorway, ignoring the participant. The test is, how long will the participant wait before interrupting?
A test of the priming.
And the results were dramatic. The students primed with rude words interrupted the conversation after about 5 minutes on average. The students primed with polite words. 82% of them never interrupted at all during the full 10-minute waiting period.
Wow. They just stood there politely for 10 minutes because they'd unscrambled words like respect without consciously deciding to be extra patient.
Exactly. Their behavior was shaped by the prime automatically. The Trivial Pursuit study adds yet another layer.
How did that work?
Before taking a really difficult general knowledge quiz, like Trivial Pursuit, students were asked to spend 5 minutes thinking about either what it means to be a professor or what it means to be a soccer hooligan.
So priming intelligence versus well, not intelligent.
Basically, yeah. And the group primed to think professor got significantly more questions right on the subsequent quiz, 55.6% correct, compared to only 42.6% for the group primed to think soccer hooligan.
A 13 percentage point difference just from thinking about professors for 5 minutes. That's huge. How did it actually make them smarter?
Probably not literally smarter, but maybe the professor prime put them in a more confident, analytical frame of mind. Maybe it made it easier for them to access information they already knew or to persevere on tough questions. The prime subtly changed their mental state in a way that improved performance under pressure.
And the implications get darker too, right? With the race and GRE study.
Yeah, that work by Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson is really important. They found that simply asking Black college students to identify their race on a demographic questionnaire before taking a difficult test, like sample GRE questions.
Just checking a box about race.
That simple act, which subtly primed awareness of racial stereotypes about academic ability, was enough to significantly impair their performance. On average, it cut the number of questions they got right in half.
Cut it in half, just from ticking a box. That's devastating. It really shows how much these subtle, unconscious cues and stereotypes in our environment can affect something as high stakes as standardized test performance.
It really does. It raises huge questions about testing fairness and how much background factors influence results.
And the most unsettling part of all these priming studies is that people don't realize it's happening, right?
Completely unaware. Barr noted that when he asked the students who walked slower why they thought they did, their explanations were basically random noise. They had no idea the word list was involved.
And Aronson found the Black students who performed poorly after the race question didn't blame the question. They blamed themselves. They thought, I guess I'm just not smart enough. They internalized the effect without knowing the cause.
It leads to this potentially uncomfortable conclusion raised in the source. Maybe our sense of free will isn't quite as complete as we like to think. Maybe we're operating on automatic pilot, influenced by subtle cues around us, much more often than we realize.
It's a little bit scary. Are we just puppets of our environment?
Well, the source also points out the upside of this locked door, this automatic pilot. It's incredibly efficient. Imagine if you had to consciously process every single social cue, every potential interpretation of a situation, you'd be paralyzed.
Like analysis paralysis.
Exactly. Priming allows our unconscious to act like a mental valet, as the source calls it. It handles all the minor background adjustments, behaving appropriately when primed for politeness, maybe accessing relevant knowledge when primed for intelligence, freeing up our conscious mind to focus on the main task at hand, like solving the sentence puzzle or answering the trivia question.
So the valet handles the routine stuff. So the boss,
Yeah.
our conscious mind, can focus on the big picture.
That's the idea. And Antonio Damasio's research on patients with damage to a specific part of the brain, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, really highlights how crucial this unconscious valet is.
What happens to these patients?
This brain area is critical for integrating emotion and decision-making. Patients with damage here can be perfectly rational, intelligent, they score well on IQ tests, but they lack judgment. They struggle intensely with making decisions, even simple ones. They get lost in endless cost-benefit analysis, finding life tiresome because they can't prioritize information effectively. They lack that gut feeling to guide them.
How did they do on that Iowa gambling test?
Fascinatingly, they could often figure out intellectually that the red decks were bad and the blue decks were good. They could tell you the rule. But they never developed the sweaty palms, that unconscious physiological hunch. And crucially, they never changed their behavior. They kept choosing from the risky red decks, even knowing they shouldn't.
So the conscious knowledge wasn't enough to drive their actions. They needed that unconscious nudge, the gut feeling.
Precisely. They had the knowledge, but there was a disconnect. They lacked the mental valet, the emotional signal from behind the locked door, to actually guide their choices in a high-stakes, fast-paced situation. It shows that pure, detached rationality isn't always the best strategy. Sometimes you need that unconscious push.
Okay, so the locked door is efficient, even necessary. But it creates another problem, doesn't it? If we can't access why we feel or act a certain way, we struggle to explain ourselves accurately. The storytelling problem.
Yes, exactly. We're not very good at introspecting on our unconscious processes. Think about speed dating again. People make these instant judgments, clicked immediately, lost me at hello. Pure snap decisions.
Gut reactions.
But the study by Iyengar and Fisman showed a huge disconnect. They had speed daters fill out questionnaires before the event, saying what qualities they were looking for in a partner, sense of humor, intelligence, ambition, whatever.
Okay, their conscious preferences.
Then, during the event, after each mini-date, they rated their actual attraction to the person they just met. And later, they indicated who they'd want to see again.
Did what they said they wanted match who they actually liked?
Not really. The qualities people claimed were important beforehand had very little bearing on who they were actually attracted to in the moment, face to face. Their preferences seemed to shift instantly based on the interaction, maybe even shifting back later when they thought about it again.
So what do people really want? The thing they list on the questionnaire, or the thing that makes them click in those first few minutes?
The researchers couldn't even agree. It highlights the conflict between our conscious ideals and the criteria our unconscious mind uses in that blink moment behind the locked door. There's no easy answer.
And it's not just about dating. Even elite performers struggle to explain what they do, right? Like Vic Braden and the Double Faults.
Exactly. Or, the source mentions baseball legend Ted Williams, who swore he watched the baseball hit his bat. But high-speed film and science show that's physically impossible, the eye can't track it that close. Or tennis pros like Andre Agassi describing how they roll their wrist on a forehand, when slow-motion video shows they actually keep it locked.
So even the experts confabulate. They create a story about what they're doing that doesn't match reality.
It seems so. We all seem prone to this storytelling problem. We're very quick to invent plausible-sounding explanations for our actions or feelings, especially when the real reasons are unconscious or unclear.
The Norman Mayer-Ropes experiment is the classic demonstration of this, isn't it?
It really is. People are in a room with two ropes hanging from the ceiling, too far apart to reach both at once. There are various objects around. The task is to tie the ropes together.
I think I remember this. There are a few solutions, but one is tricky.
Right. The fourth solution involves tying a weight, like pliers, to one rope, setting it swinging like a pendulum, then grabbing the other rope and catching the swinging one as it comes back. Most people get stuck on this one.
So how did Mayer help them?
While they were struggling, he'd casually walk across the room and accidentally brush against one of the ropes, setting it swinging slightly. Not, obviously, just a subtle nudge.
And did that work?
Like magic. Shortly after the nudge, most subjects suddenly had the aha moment and solved the puzzle using the swinging pendulum method.
Okay, so the hint worked. But did they know why they suddenly got the answer?
That's the crucial part. When Mayer asked them how they figured it out, almost nobody said, well, you bumped the rope and that gave me the idea. Only one subject out of the whole group gave the real reason.
So what did the others say?
They made up stories.
Yeah.
Plausible, logical sounding, but totally incorrect explanations. Things like, it just dawned on me, or I was thinking about how to get the ropes closer, or even, I imagine monkeys swinging in trees.
They invented explanations because the real trigger Mayer's hint was processed unconsciously. They couldn't access it, so their conscious mind filled the gap with a story.
Exactly. That's the storytelling problem in action. We feel pressure to explain ourselves even when the real reasons are behind that locked door. We confabulate.
It's like that O.J. Simpson juror, quoted by Aronson, insisting race had absolutely nothing to do with my decision, when mountains of psychological research show unconscious biases about race are incredibly common and influential.
Right. Aronson's point is stark. People are ignorant of the things that affect their actions, yet they rarely feel ignorant. We confabulate explanations rather than admitting we might not know why we did or felt something. Maybe we need to be more comfortable saying, you know what, I had a strong gut feeling, but I honestly don't know exactly why.
Accept the mystery sometimes. But there's a positive side to the Mayer experiment too, isn't there?
Yes. Even when the participants' conscious minds were completely stuck, frustrated, unable to find the solution, their unconscious minds were still working away in the background, scanning the environment, noticing clues like the swinging rope, processing that information silently, and then delivering the answer, guiding them to the solution, even if they couldn't explain how they got there.
So the unconscious is always working, even when we're consciously blocked. Okay, so we have the power of the glance, the mystery of the locked door, the storytelling problem. Now, what happens when thin slicing goes badly wrong? Not just subtly, but in a really significant way.
That brings us to what the source calls the Warren Harding error, Chapter 3 territory. This is about the dark side of thin slicing.
Warren Harding, the U.S. president, right? What was the error?
It starts back in 1899. A political operator named Harry Daugherty meets Warren Harding, who is then just a local Ohio politician, and Daugherty is instantly bowled over by Harding's appearance.
How so?
Harding was apparently incredibly handsome, tall, distinguished looking. Daugherty described him as looking like a Roman, praising his physique, his calm eyes, his great hair, good complexion, resonant voice, his courteous manner. Just the picture of gravitas and dignity.
He looked apart.
Exactly. And Doherty's immediate snap judgment was literally, gee, what a great-looking president he'd make. He even later admitted that was more accurate than thinking Harding would be a great president. Just a great-looking one.
Uh-oh. So appearance trumped substance.
Big time. By most historical accounts, Harding wasn't particularly intelligent. He was known for being lazy, kind of vague on policy issues, often absent during key Senate debates. He rose through the political ranks largely because people like Doherty pushed him forward, primarily based on how impressive he looked and sounded. He looked senatorial, he looked presidential.
So the Warren-Harding error is...
It's when we make a snap judgment based on superficial appearance, and that initial impression is so powerful it completely overrides any deeper assessment. People saw Harding's looks, his size, his features, his voice, and these triggered strong, positive, unconscious associations. Leadership, integrity, intelligence, competence. And those associations essentially shut down further critical thinking. People didn't look beneath the surface because the surface was so appealing.
They thin-sliced his appearance, but failed to thin-slice his actual abilities or character.
Precisely. And the source argues this type of error, judging based on superficial cues that trigger powerful, often misleading, unconscious associations, is at the root of many problems. Prejudice, discrimination, biases in hiring, why sometimes mediocre people get promoted to high positions. It's letting that first surface-level snap judgment dominate without digging deeper.
Which leads directly into a way to actually measure these kinds of unconscious associations, right? The implicit association test, the IAT.
Yes. The IAT is presented as a powerful tool for revealing these hidden biases that can fuel things like the Warren-Harding error.
How does it work? It sounds complicated.
The principle behind it, developed by psychologists Anthony Greenwald, Mahzarin Banaji, and Brian Nosek, is actually pretty simple. It's based on the idea that we mentally link concepts together, and we can respond faster when two concepts we strongly associate are paired.
Okay, faster reaction time equals stronger mental link.
That's the core idea. It's usually done on a computer. Words or faces flash on the screen, and you have to quickly sort them into categories by pressing specific keys. For instance, you might have to sort names as male or female, or words as good or bad.
Simple sorting tasks.
Right. Then the test cleverly combines categories. For example, it might ask you to press one key for male or career-related words and another key for female or family-related words. Then it flips the pairing. One key for male or family, the other for female or career.
Ah, so it measures if you're faster with the stereotypical pairing, male career, female family, than the counter-stereotypical one.
Exactly. The difference in your reaction speed, measured in milliseconds, is taken as an indicator of your implicit, unconscious association between those concepts. The effects are often surprisingly large and measurable. And you can actually try these tests yourself online. The source mentions the website implicit.harvard.edu.
So what about the race IAT? That's probably the most well-known one.
Right. In that version, you might sort faces as white or black, and words as good, like joy, peace, or bad, like agony, evil. The key part is comparing how fast you are when, say, white and good share the same response key versus when black and good show the key.
And what do they typically find?
The results are pretty consistent and often sobering. The source states that over 80% of individuals who take the race IAT show what's called a pro-white association, meaning they are significantly faster at pairing white faces with good words than they are at pairing black faces with good words.
80%, that's a huge majority.
Yes.
Even people who consciously believe in equality.
Yes. The author of Blank describes his own experience taking it. He felt this weird, creepy feeling, a noticeable slowdown when trying to associate black with good, and then felt mortified by how much faster he was pairing white with good. And this was despite identifying as half-black himself. His result came back as a moderate automatic preference for whites.
Wow. So it reveals a disconnect between conscious beliefs and unconscious associations.
That's the crucial point. The source emphasizes that our attitudes seem to operate on two levels. We have our conscious attitudes, the values we explicitly endorse, the beliefs we strive to live by. And then we have our unconscious attitudes, these immediate automatic associations that have been forged by a lifetime of exposure to cultural messages, media portrayals, personal experiences, everything swirling around us.
And these unconscious associations,
Yeah.
we don't choose them.
No, and they can be, and often are, completely incompatible with our conscious values. That finding that even about half of African Americans show a pro-white bias on the IAT isn't seen as internalized racism in the conscious
So
sense.
what is it then?
Banaji explains it as the unavoidable result of living in a society where white is constantly, implicitly paired with positive things, and black is often paired, implicitly or explicitly, with negative things in media, history, culture. She says, you don't choose to make positive associations with the dominant group, but you are required to. Your brain just absorbs these pervasive pairings from the environment.
So the IAT gives us a window into those automatic associations, operating behind the locked door, potentially influencing our snap judgments in ways we don't realize and might not endorse consciously, fueling those Warren-Harding errors.
Precisely. It makes the idea of unconscious bias much more concrete and measurable.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this all up. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We really have. We started with the almost startling power of thin slicing, how experts could see the truth of the Koro statue in a blink, how Gottman can predict divorce from just minutes of conversation, how strangers could judge personality better from a dorm room than friends could, how even the tone of a doctor's voice can predict malpractice suits.
Incredible predictive power in these narrow slices of experience. But then we confronted the fact that this all happens behind that locked door. It's fast, yes, but it's also deeply unconscious.
We often have no idea how we arrive at these judgments, like Vic Braden and the double faults. And our discomfort with that mystery leads us to invent stories, to demand explanations that might not reflect the real unconscious process, as shown by Mayer's rope experiment.
And we explored the dark side. The Warren-Harding error, when superficial cues trigger powerful but misleading associations, leading to prejudice and bad decisions. And the IAT giving us that uncomfortable glimpse into our own hidden biases, the unconscious associations that can contradict our conscious values.
It's a complex picture. Snap judgments can be incredibly insightful, drawing on the immense processing power of our adaptive unconscious. But they can also be flawed, biased, and easily derailed by emotion or superficial appearances.
So the core message from the source isn't just trust your gut or always analyze carefully. It's more nuanced. It's about recognizing that making sense of ourselves and the world requires understanding both modes of thinking, acknowledging the value and the dangers hidden in the blink of an eye.
Right. Like Marion True, the Getty curator involved with the Koros, eventually admitted. She initially trusted the science over the expert's intuition, but later said, now I realize I was wrong, suggesting that aesthetic judgment, that gut feeling, wasn't necessarily less objective than the scientific analysis in that case. We need both.
So for you listening, the challenge is figuring out how to apply these insights. How can you become more aware of your own snap judgments? How can you learn to better distinguish between a truly insightful thin slice and a misleading Warren-Harding error?
When should you trust that immediate feeling, that gut reaction, and when should you pause, question it, maybe seek out more information because your unconscious might be getting tripped up by bias or desire? How do you start listening more effectively to your own adaptive unconscious without letting it run unchecked?
And maybe the most provocative thought to leave you with is this. If our unconscious knows things, our conscious mind doesn't. And if we're so good at inventing plausible stories to explain ourselves, just how much of what we think we know about why we do things, why we like certain people, or why we believe certain things is just that, a convenient story.
How much of our self-perception is just a post hoc rationalization, masking the deeper, faster, more mysterious currents running beneath the surface, revealed only in that first blink? How do we learn to read the signals from behind that locked door more accurately?
Thanks for listening. Visit our library and subscribe below for more book summaries. This has been a Sprint Reads production.